Hello, I'm Toycat, and Africa is the world's fastest growing continent, but it has none of the world's top 10 biggest cities by population. This raises the obvious question, which is why? And that's what I want to answer today, because three big reasons exist for Africa's lack of megacities, and the first of these kind of relates to its area, because despite the fact that Africa is even bigger than you think, when you look at it on a globe view, you'll realize the Mercator projection has been very unkind to the size of this continent. There is so much area and so much land in Africa, but a lot of it is kind of off limits because of the curse of African geography. So outside of the Sahara Desert, which is very visible on Google Maps, it's worth noting that out of the green area where theoretically civilization could flourish, actually a lot of this is off limits to humans because mountains are not a great place to build cities or any of the related infrastructure. This is the curse of Africa, and it is an absolute pain to therefore build in the vast majority of obvious places to make a city, which is why if we look closely, you can see this green spot right here represents the third biggest city. Dr. Congo is one of the most populated countries on the continent, but when you look at this country, this size, and you try to work out where the big population center would be, you wouldn't guess right here at the very edge of the country unless you know about Kinshasa and the fact that, yeah, this actually has space to sprawl, and that's what you kind of need to get to 10 million plus people. And so what's interesting is that even though Dr. Congo has its biggest city here, its non-credentialed brother, just the regular Republic of Congo, actually has its biggest city on the other side as well, with Brazzaville, and isn't that fascinating? Even more so, in my opinion, is the lack of a river bridge between the two, but still, to get to the third biggest city, you need to have a lot of area to sprawl, and the same is true for the second biggest city in the continent, which is Lagos in Nigeria. Nigeria is a rapidly growing country, and so its capital city is growing, and a big part of why that works is because it's right by the coast, which means that it is, at least relatively speaking, quite flat, which is great. So the second big green area here makes sense, and then for Africa's first biggest city, we can head all the way off to Cairo, and everyone knows why Cairo is where it is. If you pretend you don't know, I think you're just in denial, because ultimately Cairo's river is one of the most famous in the world. I would argue the most famous, if not second after the Amazon, but the Nile flowing through Cairo is one of the big reasons for its success, which is why, although we can say that this is the real way that Africa is cursed, you know, the big your collection of mountains and semi-mountainous and desert areas on the continent, I would argue that another big part of the curse are the rivers. Something you might not have realized is that in the world, people will always tell you like, oh yeah, if you ever want to find your way back to civilization or find your way down, down, I guess, down from the mountains, just follow the river the direction that it's flowing. But fun fact, on this part of the world that should have been a quad border, this is where Botswana meets Zimbabwe, and I'm just eternally upset that they didn't make this a quad point. Four countries could have met in one place if it weren't for this tiny 100-meter strip of Botswana. But if you ever follow the Chobe River, it sometimes flows backwards, because even the basic rules of geography can get a little bit flipped in Africa, but this is especially true when looking at the map of the rivers in the continent. So outside of the fact that sometimes they flow into lakes, including by the way, the third biggest lake in the world, Lake Victoria, but outside of the fact that, like, yeah, so these rivers are kind of not as frequent as you'd like, partially because of the desert, you've also got the problem of the fact that there's only really a few of them along which most of the civilization has to be settled, and most of this isn't that great in terms of navigably getting to the rest of the world. So I think that when you add these two problems together, you end up with very few places where a city actually makes sense, and all the ones that do make a lot of sense have been settled, as we can see not just by this population density by country map, but I think most tellingly by this map right here. Look at the map of rivers on the continent, then look at the map of where people settle, and you realize, like, yeah, anywhere where there are rivers, and indeed anywhere there is water, and there is actually terrain to do so, people have been settling in very large numbers. It just so turns out there aren't as many of those spots as you would perhaps expect. At least it's not as many as I would expect, that's for sure. And so I think that is a very interesting part of Africa's geography curse, but that's only one of the reasons why the continent doesn't have as many mega cities, why they don't have, like a city the size of Tokyo or anything like that. And I think the second big reason would probably have to be the simple fact of urbanization. Generally speaking, as countries develop, they get more and more urbanized. This isn't always perfectly true. If we look at one of my favorite lists here is the list of urbanization by sovereign state, and it's on Wikipedia. Anyone can check this if you want to, but it is a stat that will show you the most urbanized countries are places like Singapore or Monaco, because they are city-states. Every single person living in those city or in those states lives in the city. That is the nature of a city-state. The same is true for the Vatican City, with its permanent population of more or less zero. But what's interesting is the least urbanized countries, and the least in the world is officially Papua New Guinea, with only 13.7% of its overall population living in urban areas. Then it's Liechtenstein Liechtenstein, which I would make a big argument about what an urban area is. Again, to be clear, this is Liechtenstein. Everyone who doesn't live in the capital city lives about a 20-minute drive from it. I would make a decent argument that you basically live in the capital of your country if you live a 20-minute drive from it, but point for a different time. But outside of those two situations, the vast majority of the unurbanized countries are actually in Africa. We've got Burundi, Niger, we've got Rwanda, Malawi, and then as you can see, it just continually goes down because Africa has far lower rates of urbanization than the rest of the world. And interestingly, this is a fact that some African leaders would argue needs to continue going up, that they need to keep their urbanization rate down because Africa as a continent has been growing massively in population, but this means that they're not actually growing enough food for themselves and they import massive amounts of food. This massive food import does have costs that could be borne by a farmer who, instead of living in Kinshasa to go work in the city doing his trading, instead could decide to go work out in Bogota on the farmland or whatever. You get the idea that having more people actually growing food would be good for the continent, and so there is actually a bit of a debate there. But even more stark, in my opinion, is the fact that because of Africa's lower GDP per capita and living standards than many parts of the world, many African populations find themselves migrating, notably to Europe and indeed North America, which means that population that would be moving to the cities in that continent end up living elsewhere. I think this is fascinating when we talk about, I don't know, like the US is famous for having quite a high black population, but I think a lot of people don't realize that it's like, you know, depending on where you are, like if you're in Miami, that black population is probably from the Caribbean. If you're in the South, it's probably, you know, that got that whole long pretext to it that's beyond the scope of this video. But in cities like LA and New York, you'll find that more and more it is an urbanized population coming from Africa, the continent itself. That is to say, 1 or 2 generations old, which is fascinating and again, true across a lot of the world. You've probably noticed it in your city, and it's a problem that happens when living standards are so diverse, when living standards have such a big gap between them, and so it represents another problem for the urbanization of Africa. And overall, that urbanization is the reason why, even though Africa's population isn't massively far off eventually overtaking Asia's, they don't have any cities quite as big as Guangzhou, Shanghai, Tokyo, Delhi, or even Jakarta. There's quite a big gap between even Cairo, which is by far the biggest, and then certainly when we get down to Lagos, you can see we've gone into the weeds. We're like below New York City in its entire external area there, which I think New York City might be a great position here to bring us into our third point, because ultimately one of the reasons why Africa doesn't have a megacity that is formed, why Africa doesn't have a population center that is really surpassed anywhere else, and I think we can put this down to what you might call the civilization tech tree. Have you ever played Civilization, where sometimes you'll have spearmen fighting helicopters and the spearmen will win, right? But it's like, you know, it's still this giant tech gap that can be created. Well, this is something that exists in the world, and let me explain to you of MS Paint. I'm sorry, the budget was too high on this video, so we're gonna have to down budget things a bit here. But you might be familiar with the fact that, yeah, across the West, we kind of have the tech tree of, say, humans went from down at the bottom here, talking to each other, then we invented telegraphs, which was amazing, or maybe you could argue horseback rides, but we went from telegraphs, then we invented cell phone towers where you could get signal sent that way, and now we just do it from the internet, from satellites in space with our phone. Now, the cool thing about Africa is that things like this for a lot of parts of African civilization, they can just skip all those other parts and go straight from you are talking to each other, now you have a phone that has, you know, everyone's favorite game on it. Not sponsored. Maybe I should be though. But you know, like everyone knows that, like, oh yeah, you can skip straight from this to that, and that means that Africa can actually save a huge amount of money, not having to build telegraph machines, but more importantly, not having to build these giant pieces of infrastructure, and that is a big boon, right? You know, you might know that a lot of like internet stuff is actually done straight from the telephone in various African nations because they could skip all of the middlemen, which is actually pretty great if you ask me. And this is good for lots of technologies, but it represents a problem when it comes to transportation. And the simplest way to describe this would be, well, actually, let's quickly go back to Egypt. So Cairo is famous for doing this on a massive scale. They do have a small metro. It is the biggest city in Africa. They have a small metro of 3 lines, but most of the way that they build transport infrastructure is what you might call less than desirable from an outside perspective. This is what they'll end up building: massive highways that go right past people's mega apartment buildings. And outside of the fact that I think this is depressing, I think like people who live like here as the highway slowly expands closer and closer to their windows, I think that can be like, you know, a point of like why you might not want to live there. But it also becomes really inefficient as cities. Basically, as a lot of African cities have jumped straight in human civilization, or in the rest of Western civilization, we jumped from having human beings to having trains. This is the train logo in the UK. We went straight from having human beings, then we had trains, which were way better than human beings just walking themselves, or horses, and then we jumped from trains to cars. However, in Africa, they can do the jump of going straight like this. Oh, the car is on the train now. What have we created? We just make the first tram in Africa. Anyway, the important thing here is you can skip straight from not having any trains whatsoever into going straight to cars, which seems like a huge improvement. Again, the amount of money that was spent on building railway in the West that many people think is backwards and outdated is very, very, very high. And so if you're able to be building in Africa, you might see it as just as much of an advantage that you can build straight to modern day things, skipping all that silly rail stuff from the past. But this creates huge problems, not just on a congestion level. Again, driving around Cairo, I cannot imagine is fun. In fact, can we get the traffic directions level? Oh, it's it's 11 a.m. and actually Cairo has very little traffic. You know, besides the 6th of October bridge over here, very, very fun name for a bridge. But actually, no, you can see there's a decent amount of traffic for what should be not peak time, and this is a problem which is going to not just compound in terms of people don't like to be in traffic, but it's a problem for cities where the population are not all rich enough to buy a car. I mean, say what you will about, say, an American city that doesn't have a metro. Las Vegas is the one I know best. But Las Vegas has a population of about 1 million, and that's kind of as capped as it can be while using the car. But the people who were building all those roads kind of were building it for the majority of the population. 90+% of Vegas households have access to a car, and so as a result, even though you're building these huge roads at public expense and ignoring the railway connections outside of, again, that one very particular railway on the strip, look at this. Very, very useful, very many locations. But outside of that one railway that does exist, it's kind of ignoring that. But you can argue it's at least for the majority of the people. Again, it's whether it's great urban design to get a large population, to get great urban areas or whatever, is debatable. But let's just say the only bus you'll find... Wait, 95 bus. Yeah, there's a bus over here. Oh, it's going to be for business, isn't it? The only bus you'll find are busnesses is... Anyway, so that is at least a democratic decision that matches the average income. But when you're talking about cities like Cairo or Lagos or indeed Kinshasa especially, the average income in those cities is, well, substantially lower, isn't it? And so as a result, building huge amounts of car infrastructure, as they have done, is not actually the most efficient way to get around these places. Indeed, even the forms of public transportation that exist, the minibuses, are far less efficient than having, say, even a single-decker bus, or even better, a double-decker bus or a tram. You could have much more efficient forms of transport, and more efficient forms of transport means you can have more people living in a smaller area. The problem, the fact that every African city has to sprawl so much means that there is a limit to how much the population can get to before people are just living too far away from the city. I think Lagos, if I can pick on it a little bit, it does have a urban train system of some form. I have not heard great things about it, but they spend huge amounts of money building. Look at this. It's a bridge that goes just directly over the ocean here. Or not at the ocean, it's a lake. But, look at that. That is absolutely crazy. This must have been a huge amount of money to build. And again, if you're an African politician, you might feel smart being like, yes, we will not spend the money building the railway. We'll jump straight to the car, like people love to use in the Western countries. But actually, if you look at the biggest cities, whether that's London, I would make a decent argument. London does have motorways to connect people up, but most commuters don't even use them. Most commuters into the city actually end up using a train, which is great because it means you can build those roads less wide, and also it means that a lot of people don't need to use it. It's got lots of cost benefits, but it also has quality of life benefits for those who cannot drive, etc., etc. The same is true for New York. New York is, again, in one of the least public transport friendly countries. New York has not just a metro with an ungodly number of lines, by the way. Look at this. It also has multiple commuter rail systems, multiple regional rail systems, connections to that one high-speed rail corridor in the country. New York does have rail, amazingly, despite the country that it's in. And especially when we talk about East Asian cities, the three biggest in the world being Tokyo. Do I need to explain rail in Tokyo? I don't think I do. Or indeed, we could talk about Shanghai, where, again, you're probably familiar with it, but even Guangzhou, a city that I think a majority of people aren't that familiar with, is absolutely covered, not just in highways, those are important too, because a lot of people are going to need to drive from where they are, goods need to get around, etc., but also it's covered in metro. Actually, you know what? I can't find the metro in Guangzhou itself. I think Guangzhou is it technically counts like all of the areas around it, so it's going to have, the point here is it's going to be very, very surrounded by lots of rail connections. So let's go to public transport, and there we go, look at that. So Guangzhou has its own metro system, but then Shenzhen, which is part of the area, has its own metro system, and I'd be surprised if Dongguan does not have any of its own, but this is a thing that is important, having other forms of transport, or I guess in this case, sprawling so far that it doesn't matter anyway. Look how many roads you need to get to 70 million people. Even if you're going to ignore public transport, even if you're going to ignore the fact that a decent percent of the population in these cities are not going to be car-owning households, even if we choose to ignore those facts, you still ultimately arrive at the conclusion that, like, oh yeah, you're going to desperately need to have that. And so how can Africa solve these problems, I guess? I think ultimately Africa is growing. Africa will inevitably get bigger cities, and eventually one of the African cities might even end up being one of the biggest on the planet by population. However, to get there, urbanization does need to be worked out. How can Africa have more of its population living in urban areas without contributing to the food problems, which are indeed plaguing the continent? That is a problem that needs to be solved. And the other problem that needs to be solved is city design that would prioritize. Again, I'm not one of those people who would say, cars are silly and should never be allowed anywhere. But you need to have complementary transport networks. Every person who gets on a train is a person who doesn't get in a car, which means every 1,000 of those is another lane you don't need to build, which is a huge amount of money that you can save, while also allowing people to live in denser areas, which is great because you can't have cities that go on forever. Literally, in the case of Lagos, you're eventually going to hit you're eventually going to hit Benin. Literally, in the case of, I think even more strongly in Dr. Congo, if your city expands any further, people are going to be living in a different country. And so that is something that I assume African cities are on the plan to solve, but those are the 3 big reasons that they don't exist yet. I hope you'll enjoy this kind of more analytical deep dive into a problem that you've probably wondered about. If you enjoyed it, then like the video or something. I'm just kidding. Second channel. I hope you'll enjoy this geography video, because for now, don't care, and I'll see you for another one next week. Goodbye.